What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now! I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now! Is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. In the last episode of Real Democracy Now! A podcast, I spoke to Professor Jeanette Harps-Karp from Curtin University in Western Australia about how she approached the design and delivery of deliberative mini-publics. Today I talked to Peter McLeod, the principal and founder of MASS LBP, a Canadian consultancy focused on democratic innovation and public strategy. MASS LBP has conducted 25 major reference panels, citizens' assemblies and commissions for different levels of government involving more than 1,000 Canadians. And by the way, in case you were wondering, LBP stands for Led by People. I asked Peter to tell us about how MASS LBP approaches the design of deliberative mini-publics.
Let's split this question in two, because I think that it's worth talking a little bit about the language that gets used, the nomenclature of all of this stuff, because I smile every time you say the word mini-public, which of course is a term quite popular in Australia and certainly in the deliberative literature. But every time you say mini-public, I think about those little Lego minifigures or something like this. And it's not a phrase that gets used very often in Canada. I think everyone is trying to find their way towards a common language. And for me, I've settled more on talking about participation, for instance, than engagement or consultation. And for the obvious reasons that someone can engage me, someone can consult me, but someone can't participate me. I think what we're trying to do is start with individuals in their communities, and that, we want to create a context where they can take initiative. And so participation is perhaps preferred. We talk about these kinds of processes as, in the generic sense, as long-form deliberative processes. And that's intended to distinguish, of course, the shorter workshops or one-day sessions from the juries, commissions, and assemblies that, of course, can take up several days, weeks, or months of time. We quite deliberately decided to refer to our processes then as reference panels. And I like this terminology because I think it strikes the right balance between esteeming the work of the participants who are part of the deliberation, while not also treading on the toes of elected officials. I know that in Ontario and BC, the term citizens' assembly seemed somewhat grandiose. And I think that got up the noses of elected officials. And perhaps they were being too sensitive, but perhaps also not unreasonably. And in our way of thinking, what elected officials or senior public authorities are doing is referring an issue to a group of citizens, residents who are going to, with the benefit of time and resources and the opportunity to become better informed, refer back a series of recommendations. And it's been very interesting just to see how a simple change in terminology like that lets everyone relax and actually focus on what's most important, not a question of status or hierarchy, but instead a question of function and the value that those respective bodies or institutions can create. Our recruitment process we refer to as a civic lottery, and we like calling it that because we want people to feel good about winning. Now, it's not a contest in that sense, but as I'm sure you're aware from your own experiences, there are few things more heartening in this field of work than having randomly selected the name of a participant and calling her or him at home and having them react as though they did just win the lotto. And, they're calling to their spouse, hey, George, I've just won 4 Saturdays to talk about, drug coverage or something like this. And, that's always a very kind of heartwarming and exciting moment for us. So we refer to them as civic lotteries, and, the resulting group we simply refer to as the participants or the panelists. who typically, in our case, we tend to bring together groups of about 36 people who on average will spend 4 to 6, maybe 8 Saturdays of their time over the course of several months working on behalf of different clients. I guess two things that are worth pointing out. Even though there is so much focus on engagement and participation right now, I'm always quick to point out that every time you hear the phrase public engagement, you need to think of its flip side, public learning. And those things are flip sides of the same coin. And we need to bring a kind of co-learning ethic to what we're doing. So our clients are learning from citizens are learning from our government clients. That's the atmosphere that you're striving to create. So I much prefer to talk about learning than I do about engagement. And in that sense, I think we're trying in modest ways to connect with what was once a very progressive tradition in Canada, the adult education movement. Now, to talk about education or learning and deliberation is immediately to leave yourself open to criticism that, well, all you're doing is introducing bias and teaching to a test. You're trying to get the response, in ways that are overt or covert your client is most interested in hearing. That, of course, isn't the case, and there's some very important safeguards that we build into our processes to ensure that that can't happen. But when it comes to the design of our work at MassLBP, this is fairly kind of classic stuff when it comes to deliberation. We have our random representative sample, which we create through the civic lottery. So typically, we'll send out between 5,000 and 10,000 letters through Canada Post. And occasionally we'll create little annexes to this process that would allow underrepresented populations to volunteer. But most typically, 5,000 to 10,000 letters go out. We have maintained a 4 to 7% response rate, and people can sign up either by phone or by web or by a business reply envelope. And interestingly, across all ages, despite the fact that so many people are packing smartphones, they still send in their candidate response card by mail. So from amongst that pool of several hundred people, we'll then randomly select a group, again, say of 36. It'll be half men and half women. It'll be stratified for age and also for geography. Very occasionally, we'll build in other attributes, but we've found, having conducted, more than 30 of these lotteries and reaching, more than 250,000 households, that questions of ethnicity and education and income come out in the wash, because when we sample for geography, of course, it's such a strong predictor of these other attributes. Selecting for them individually isn't necessary. So then we convert our office into what we like to joke is the civic concierge, and we begin the very pleasant but also labor-intensive task of calling everyone and onboarding them to the process. We think it's our responsibility to staff people so that they feel equipped to bring their best. Our job is to meet them where they're at and to see that they can make a constructive contribution to the process. The reference panel itself, supposing that it's taking place over 4 Saturdays, during which there will be one public fifth event, probably midway through the process, follows a pretty traditional schematic where you begin with a lot of intensive learning, and that tapers very quickly as you begin getting into more of an active dialogue and deliberation. It follows a pattern of moving from the kind of big picture values to identifying issues, to thinking about the priorities amongst those issues, and ultimately drafting very detailed recommendations. And, that's an important feature of our work, that the participants themselves, they draft their own report, and we've come up with a number of I guess, mechanisms or methods that help the group very quickly find consensus on their recommendations and draft it so that by the end of that last day, they can give some kind of oral presentation with a set of draft recommendations. We'll then take a week or two collaborating online just to polish the document And we leave room at the end for anyone to write a minority report if they feel that some aspect of the process was lacking, or they don't agree or want to draw attention to any recommendation. So it's a long answer, but in a nutshell, that's how we go about our work. The drafting of the letter is always a very big occasion in our office, and I have trouble pointing to any package we've created that hasn't gone through more than a dozen drafts. But perhaps what's most important to understand is where we're coming from when we write it. I guess there are two things worth mentioning. The first is that we always frame that invitation as a matter of public service. So it's not about come have your say, do you care about transit in your community, We think about it as a big ask and a clear task. So first of all, the message would be something to the effect of, you're really lucky. You're one of only 10,000 households to receive this letter. And this is a call to public service. And in this capacity, whether you know much about this issue or not, you're going to have the opportunity to become better informed and help shape the policies around an issue that may not affect you directly, but will affect the lives of many people in the community. And we don't shy away from what's being asked. We make it as approachable, but also as serious as possible. And, these things come out with, government letterhead, and they get sent in brown envelopes, which in Canada usually signifies a tax form. In fact, we've found that when we send it on brown paper instead of white paper, we end up getting a 1% bump in our response rate. So it looks official. We also, we strive to make these things as easy to understand as possible. They're probably written at a higher than grade 6 level, which I know is the standard in a lot of government communications. But we haven't seen any fall off in those with lower educational attainment. We have a 1-800 line, which is staffed 24/7. We encourage people to call us, and they certainly do. We'll have hundreds of phone calls for any lottery with people asking questions or points of clarification. It starts, with first impressions, and that's when you begin framing expectations. So often, though not always, we write what we've come to call a dual contract. And one half of that contract is what we as MAS are going to do and what we're going to get paid, which we also often make public. And the second half is what the government client agrees to do with the recommendations. And broadly, that falls into three categories. The first is that they are going to acknowledge that this process is taking place. And that sounds like a very low bar. But by, contrast to focus groups and all kinds of other public opinion research, often government buries that. And by acknowledging it, we don't just mean, grudgingly admit that it's taking place. We mean that it's going to have a position of prominence on its website and in other related communications, that senior leadership is going to talk about this process taking place. So that's the first category. The second is that government is going to respond to those recommendations. And again, it's not going to be a pro forma letter that says, thank you for your participation. It's going to be a recommendation by recommendation account of whether government thinks that it can act, and if so, in what kind of time frame, and where it can't, why not, and where it needs to make an amendment, how so. And then the third is actually a kind of goodwill effort to act on the recommendations themselves. It doesn't, and it wouldn't be appropriate to try and bind government's hands that you've actually devolved the decision to the group, but that in some, though not all instances, they're going to try and work with those recommendations to put them into effect. We never pay honoraria to our participants. And we've been very careful to monitor whether that then creates an insurmountable barrier to people who, struggle and need income. We always, in our civic lottery materials, explain that if there is a case of financial hardship, that we can provide some sort of compensation, but not directly for lost wages. And we're very careful, of course, to make sure that we see that no one is out of pocket. So we will pay for childcare. We will pay for elder care. We will pay for any form of transportation. We'll do whatever is necessary to lower the barriers to their participation. But as a matter of course, it is framed as public service. And in this way, for us, the model or the standard isn't the traditional court-based jury. It's the coroner's jury, where people, in Canada at least, can be summoned to serve on what is a non-adversarial courtroom process to learn about the facts behind a wrongful death. And we've tried to benchmark some of our approaches and the kind of democratic standards against very, very long-standing processes like that one. I think reference panels as highly specialized tools. And so they're not fit for every circumstance. And as proponents of this work, we have to be very clear-eyed about when we think the winning conditions can obtain to make a process like this valuable and successful. I think we have a responsibility to be quite disciplined that way, because even though we're trying to popularize this work, when it's misapplied, it can very quickly erode confidence in all other efforts. So for me, I guess some of the things are quite obvious. One, it's got to be something that the existing institutions of government, for some reason, can't do well themselves. It's got to be an instance where there's something that government, let's say, doesn't know or doesn't have a line of sight against that only a process like this can provide. It's got to be manageable. And that's a sort of funny criteria. But oftentimes I have clients wanting a group to not only speak to one issue, but to speak to the half dozen issues around it, right? So that would be to ask too much of the process. Anyway, there are lots of both objective and subjective criteria that go into determining whether an issue is going to be appropriate or well addressed by this kinds of process, but it is highly context specific.
Peter also described a couple of processes which MAS LBP have convened and how decision makers have responded to the reference panel's recommendations.
Well, it's been such a range of topics that we've addressed over the course of the past 8 or 9 years. It's been everything from privacy legislation in British Columbia to thinking about mental health services nationally. This autumn, we'll be conducting our second national reference panel on the question of pharmacare or universal drug coverage. We've worked on land use issues from the citywide perspective right down into very small subsets of large cities. A couple of processes stand out. Back in 2012, the province of Ontario needed to review the Condominium Act. Now, Toronto and Ontario has gone a little bit condominium crazy just because of the rapidly escalating housing prices. And yet the act hadn't been updated since the 80s. And so we were invited to develop a province-wide reference panel that met in 2 phases. First, over several weekends, in order to review the existing act, to identify their priorities for reform. At one point, that direction was handed over to a technical working group that spent the better part of a year doing the fine-grained drafting of amendments to that legislation. The panel was then reconvened for a final weekend, a little less than a year later, and they reviewed all of that work and provided further direction and counsel. There was a lot. It was probably an exemplary process for a more collaborative approach to policymaking, of which the reference panel was one part. But because, so much of an individual's net worth is tied up in their housing, and so much of that housing today is in a condominium structure, the governance management of those organizations is really, really critical. We were pleased when the legislation finally made its way to the legislature that it received all party support. And we've been told subsequently that for the opposition parties, one of the major determinants of their support was the thoroughness of the process. So that's a very gratifying thing to see. It's a very nice design, absolutely, and I think it has broad replicability. The number 36 comes up over and over just because we've found that it's a kind of not too big, not too small group where you can break into 6 groups of 6. You can address a lot of issues concurrently, but it's not so large that people can't establish good working relationships with one another in fairly short order. One of the more controversial processes, I guess, of the past 2 years was a hyper-local process, and it took place in Vancouver, British Columbia, and it concerned a neighborhood called Grandview Woodland. Vancouver is I think rightly known for very exemplary planning processes, but for one reason or another, the process to develop a 30-year plan in this community that would guide all of the development in that time was compromised. There was a provincial election and certain promises got made, and the community really pushed back. And this was after a year of good outreach from the planning department to that community. Nevertheless, that process became so compromised that the deputy mayor called for a citizens' assembly to be created, echoing the language of the original BC Citizens' Assembly on electoral reform 8 years before. And so we got a phone call from the planning department saying, what the heck is a citizens' assembly and how would we do it? And we waded in to a very divided community where there was a lot of suspicion, frankly, that this assembly was just some kind of front for an agenda that had already been determined at City Hall. It was an extraordinary ask in that the panelists ended up spending 12 Saturdays of their time over the course of a year and having to review more than 200 recommendations that were contained in the planning department's original report. And in addition to those dozen formal meetings, there were probably a dozen other community walks, town hall meetings of various description that were occurring. It was concurrent with the planning department's own secondary process. It was quite an extraordinary volume of kind of civic activity for the purposes of developing this plan. And there was a lot of pushback along the way. But nevertheless, the panel succeeded in producing its own report that commented on those 200 recommendations, added more than 70 recommendations at a neighborhood and sub-neighborhood level, highly granular stuff. It brought that report to City Council, presenting it to them directly. City Council unanimously accepted and endorsed their report. And I'm told just in the past month or two, the planning department actually brought forward that new 30-year plan. And it reflects on balance 80 to 90% of the recommendations that the members of the Assembly have made. So in that sense, it's a happily ever after story. Canada has one additional wrinkle that doesn't affect Australia in quite the same way. We're a bilingual country. So when we're running a national panel, we're doing it in both French and English simultaneously. And, also a very large country like Australia, it makes it very prohibitive to bring people together for multiple occasions. So we end up bringing them in for a kind of 4.5 day concentrated program. And, people are astounded to hear that, my goodness, these poor people, they've just, traveled for 10 hours to get to Ottawa, and then they're in session for almost 12 hours in a day. But over the course of that very intensive program and working in 2 languages, and yes, there are still 36 of them, they manage to bring this esprit de corps and sense of purpose and work their way through the issues in a slightly different fashion than the panels that are spaced out between weekends, but still quite effectively. We've been careful to stay a little bit below the public radar because the way in which the wider community would find out about this is if it's reported on by the media. And though there have been articles about our work and about specific processes, I don't think it's reached the same degree of public consciousness that it has in Australia, or which it briefly did amongst, the sort of think tank world in Britain. And again, that's been our preference, to show, not tell.
In the next episode, we'll be back in Australia, looking at how the New Democracy Foundation designs and delivers deliberative mini-publics. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.